Tonight on Primetime Politics, inching closer to a majority.
One of Canada's greatest constituency MPs.
I'm very thankful to be so warmly welcomed.
The Prime Minister welcomes another floor crosser to the Liberal ranks, Lori Idlout, the Member of Parliament for Nunavut, abandoning the NDP to join the government side. Coming up, we'll get some reaction from the NDP's former National Director, Anne McGrath. Also,
so today, I'm announcing a $10 million investment in the Canada Community Security Program.
the Liberals announced new money to help Jewish communities enhance security at synagogues and schools. We'll talk about that funding with Ruby Sahota, the Secretary of State responsible for combating crime. And
I don't think most Canadians saw the NDP as viable in that existential moment for our country.
Filmmaker Avi Lewis on his run to lead the federal NDP. This is Primetime Politics. Hello everyone, I'm Michael Serapio. Well, the Prime Minister was all smiles this morning, happy to begin a Liberal caucus meeting, walking in with the newest member of his team, Nunavut MP Lori Idlout, who crossed the floor today, leaving the NDP to join the federal government.
Well, I'm very honored to welcome Lori Idlout to our caucus. It is a great pleasure. One of Canada's greatest constituency MPs. You represent a riding that is the size of Mexico, and very down to earth. And we've had conversations about what we can do, both large and small, in Nunavut. Large projects, but also helping everyone get ahead. So all for Canada, Canada for all.
Lori, what did the government say to get you to cross the floor? What did they tangibly promise you? More consultation, specific asks? Like what incentivized you?
Like with any complicated issue, it wasn't just one thing that happened. There are a variety of many things that have allowed me to really reflect on this, and I'm very thankful to be so warmly welcomed.
Now, Ms. Idlout is the fourth floor crosser to join the Liberal ranks and the first New Democrat to do so. And with her addition, the Liberals now have 170 seats in the House of Commons, just 2 seats shy of a majority that could be secured in 3 upcoming by-elections scheduled for April. Well, with that, let's take a listen right now to some Liberal MPs who spoke about today's development, both celebrating and defending Ms. Idlout's right as an MP to cross the floor.
I think it's fantastic. Way to go, Lori, for crossing the line. We've been doing a lot of work, just cross party lines, focusing on the North and what's important to her and to our ministry. So really happy to see this.
And I'm not surprised to see colleagues which are doing soul searching and say, I want to be at the decision table. I want to be there because, you know, to just look at the polls, Canadians are behind the agenda we have put forward.
Is an extraordinary moment in which we are living, and it demonstrates again that the Liberal Party is a big tent party, that we're the centrist party, but we have people a little bit more on the right and a little bit more on the left, and that's how we get to the best policies for Canadians.
But while Liberals celebrate and defend the floor crossing, the NDP's interim leader, Don Davies, well, he says the decision to cross over betrays the people who voted for Ms. Idlout as a New Democrat.
The position of the New Democratic Party on floor crossing is long-standing and clear. To us, the decision of voters at the ballot box is a sacred trust. And if a member of Parliament wants to override that decision, we believe they must go back to the voters and make that case to them and receive a renewed mandate.
Well, let's talk about all of this with Anne McGrath, the NDP's former national director, also former chief of staff to the late Jack Layton, these days with the strategic consulting firm Catalyze 4, and of course, no stranger to this program. And good to see you again.
Nice to see you, Michael.
Nice seeing you. Listen, you know, Ms. Idlout did not keep it a secret. She'd been talking for months now. The fact that the Liberals have been reaching out to her, asking if she would cross the floor to join the government. So does this really come as a surprise to party insiders?
I don't think it comes as a surprise surprise because we did know that we knew that she'd been considering it. We knew that she rejected the idea at a certain point, but I also know that there was a bit of a full court press to get her to actually change her mind and actually come over to the Liberal side of the House. So it's not a surprise. It is a huge disappointment.
Okay.
And I think for a lot of, I've been through many floor crossings on all sides for many years now. And the thing that I know is I never feel too gleeful when I see somebody cross the floor to another side, even if it has nothing to do with us, because I know how hard people work to get these guys elected. And so what I feel like when I look at what happened with Lori is that her supporters, the members of the NDP, the volunteers, her riding association, what a huge betrayal this is to them. And not just her riding association, which I think is massive, but also I think people across the country, New Democrats across the country were very excited by her. And I contributed. I know others did as well because it was so fantastic when we were able to win that seat with her. And she was such a strong advocate for the people in her community.
A strong advocate, as you say, and to hear it from her, though, she does want to keep advocating for the people of Nunavut, and she essentially believes she can do so more effectively with the government than outside the government. What do you say to that?
I'm not sure that that's true. I think that she will probably get a lot of perks for the next little while, but I think that basically being a backbench MP gives you a little less influence, I would say, than an opposition MP. And I think that she's had the NDP has not had a lot of seats in Parliament for the last several years now, but we've often been able to make a really big impact, definitely more than most of the backbench at the governing caucus.
Now, you talk about a full court press to get her to cross over. What type of outreach do you think was made here?
I think that not only the Prime Minister, but many of the cabinet ministers and MPs were reaching out to her. They were calling her. They were, courting her, basically. And if you look, it's obvious that she's had private meetings with the Prime Minister in his office. We've seen the photos. And I saw today that she was sitting beside the Prime Minister in the House during question period. So I'm sure she's, and even if you look at the most recent floor crossers, they're going on international trips. They're getting special titles. There are things that come with that kind of a floor crossing, but I don't think it lasts. And I think that they will all find that they have much less of a voice now than they had before.
Now, we did hear from Don Davies, of course, the NDP's interim leader, and he essentially said that these kinds of things need to be decided by voters. What party represents what riding? It shouldn't be decided in backroom deals. The pushback against that was from Karina Gould, former Liberal House leader, who says, well, this is the Westminster system. MPs are elected and MPs decide the best way they can represent their constituents. What do you say to that kind of pushback?
It's totally true that it's a legitimate part of the system, the Westminster system. That doesn't mean that everything in the Westminster system is completely democratic. And I think that a lot of voters vote for a party. And certainly if you look at the history of floor crossing, you will see that often if the floor crosser runs again in the next election, that they're not successful. As a matter of fact, our leader, Don Davies, won in Vancouver Kingsway and has held that seat for something like 18 years now, partly as a result of a floor crossing when the Conservatives got David Emerson to cross the floor over to them. And people did not vote for a Conservative in that riding. They voted for a Liberal. And now they vote for Don Davies. They vote for a New Democrat. And I think that we see that all over the place. People vote for some people do vote for the individual, but rarely. It's usually that they're casting their vote for the party and the leader.
Yeah, and ultimately we'll have to see if and when the next election happens, how Ms. Idlout does in her riding. But of course, this reduces the NDP unofficial caucus to 6 now in the House of Commons. Rumors are you could be losing another if Alexandre Boulris crosses into provincial politics to be with Quebec Solidaire. How devastating would it be for the NDP if Ms. Idlout is quickly followed by Alexandre Boulardis out of the caucus.
Well, there's no question that these are tough times. Like we lost official party status, we went down in seats, now we've lost another MP, potentially there could be others, I agree with that, but we've been through tough times before, and I think particularly now, the voice of the NDP and the activism of the NDP is really necessary. The Mark Carney government is quite conservatively minded, and I don't think that's any secret. He's running the government like a business, and I'm sure that a lot of Canadians were very disappointed to see his support for an illegal war in an attempt to appease an out-of-control president. And so I think that, and there's just so many issues where the voice of progressives is missing now. And so I think that there will be there are opportunities for the NDP, particularly when we get our new leader in place. And we have been through this before. I mean, you know, Tommy Douglas had a very devastating loss where he famously quoted Sir Andrew Barton and said, you know, I am slain, but I am, you know, I'm wounded, but I'm not slain. I will basically I'll rise again. And we've seen it over and over. I was an active New Democrat in Alberta when we went down to 0 seats in the legislature, and we had lost party status federally. And years later, we formed a majority government in Alberta and the largest official opposition ever in our party in federally. So it's possible to rebuild, and I'm committed to doing that rebuild.
So what does that mean then about what is needed in the next leader of the federal NDP? Because as you referenced right now, it started Monday, 12:01 a.m. The voting is now underway for the next leader of the federal party. Yeah. What is needed out of this next leader, given the existential challenge that the NDP seems to be up against right now?
Well, number one, hard work. It's going to take a lot of meetings with small groups of people. I think reaching out and pulling people into the party. I don't think that we can be, I think that, and healing divisions. There are divisions in every party, and certainly during a leadership, some of those divisions become very acute. So it's healing those divisions, drawing people in, and presenting that really strong, progressive, principled voice in opposition to the government, in a contrast to the Conservatives, so that Social Democrats and progressives across the country feel like they have a home where their voices are heard.
Well, Anne McGrath, you and I will be speaking around the convention, but for now, to talk about this development, thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael.
Well, we did hear from both Liberals and New Democrats ahead of my conversation with Anne on the floor crossing. But take a listen right now to Conservative MP Michael Cooper.
It's very clear that the Prime Minister has a strategy, and that is to pick up members of Parliament through floor crossings to secure a majority that he didn't earn at the ballot box. It's fundamentally undemocratic, and the members who have made the decision to cross ultimately have to answer to their constituents.
Well, also in Ottawa today, the federal government announced extra funding for its Canada Community Security Program, $10 million to help Jewish communities in the country to secure gathering spaces, synagogues, and places of worship. Now, in the last week alone, 3 synagogues in Toronto were shot at, just the latest incidents underlining a rising trend of anti-Semitism in the country. Take a listen now to what we heard today from the Public Safety Minister, Gary Anandasangari.
Canada's Jewish community is anxious, fearful, and those feelings are quite justified. These were assaults on the Jewish community and the right of Jewish Canadians to live and pray in safety. When you attack a synagogue, you attack all places of worship. When you attack a single group of Canadians, and in this case, Jewish Canadians, you attack all Canadians.
Well, here to talk about the funding and the crimes that have led to it, we're now joined by Ruby Sahota, the Secretary of State for Combating Crime. Ms. Sahota, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
So, we are very aware that hate crimes have doubled in this country since about 2018. We also know when it comes to religious communities in this country, Jewish Canadians are the most targeted in terms of hate crimes in Canada. Yeah. Is $10 million enough to address the rising tide, essentially the anti-Semitism that we're seeing?
Yeah. You know, like Minister Ananda Sangari said today during the press conference when announcing this $10 million, this is in addition to the program that already exists, which 70% of the funding had already been going to synagogues and Jewish community centers. So this is not the end all of the funding, but this is a top up to the funding that was already being provided. And recently I've met with many different synagogues, some that have had various different incidents, and I was just at Temple Emmanuel the other week as well, where they had experienced a shooting in Toronto, and of course the synagogue in Thornhill that's experienced it. It is a very you know, it should not be happening is what we're saying, but it is happening. So we need to address it in every way possible, and protection is one of the ways that many of these synagogues say they need more flexibility in, and so we're looking at the program. Mm-hmm. It has been made more flexible than the previous iteration of this program when it was called the Security Infrastructure Fund. Since that time in 2024, when we revamped the program, the process has been a bit less cumbersome. There's been more investment put into it. However, I think, you know, after talking to groups, there are other enhancements and improvements we're looking at. And so this is just one step of the different array of things that we are planning on doing in the coming weeks and months. Okay. But $10 million, this is, you know, specifically to those groups in Montreal, in Toronto that have been affected. $5 million to Toronto, $2.5 million to Montreal, and another $2.5 million across the country. That is where a lot of the population is, and so I think it's going to help.
Okay, going to help, as you say, and you also say it's one step, and we know that groups like B'nai B'rith are asking for more. In fact, just yesterday they sent out a release given the attacks that are happening on synagogues in Toronto, and amongst the things that they're asking for is a national anti-Semitism task force, one that would bring together police forces on the federal, provincial, you know, local jurisdictions. Is that something that your government is looking at?
Look, we're open to doing whatever it takes to help the community to fight anti-Semitism and hate in our country. We held an anti-Semitism summit previously. A lot of recommendations have come out of that. We're looking at, you know, have implemented and, you know, working on implementing other recommendations. And so we're absolutely open to anything that can help improve safety. But right now, the RCMP, CSIS is investigating, you know, are always looking at whether there is something within their purview to examine in these cases. But the RCMP is working with local law enforcement on these cases. And if local law enforcement, through their coordination efforts right now on the current cases, if they feel that a task force could help enhance their coordination, then we'd absolutely be open to it. But I think it's important for law enforcement to be a part of that conversation, because we want to do things that are going to be effective and deliver results on the ground.
Mm-hmm. You deliver results. Is there a timeline on this? Because of the other things that B'nai B'rith is asking for is, for example, charging these crimes as domestic terrorism, treating them as such when it goes through the legal system. Yeah. You know, I hear what you're saying. You're consulting, you're talking, but what kind of timeline do you have in mind?
In terms of the investigations, those are done by our law enforcement agencies, right? So that's not something that the government puts a timeline on. Of course, you know, in every indication possible, we are stating that this is of the utmost priority and urgency for us to be able to tackle this issue so our communities feel safe. It's my expectation as the Secretary of State for Combating Crime that law enforcement in my conversations are also taking this as their utmost priority, and hopefully we see results in their investigations very, very soon. But in terms of the conversation, it's live and active right now, and so resources that are needed, or whether we call something a task force or whether they continue coordinating the way they do, I think what the community would want to see is arrests made, and if there are links to be made to any terrorist entities or other outside of our country, organizations outside of our country, then that those links are drawn and clear information is provided to the public, because there are tools that are available when somebody is linked to a terrorist entity under our rules, right, under the Terrorism Act. There's a lot of different...
including domestic, because I think that's what they're pointing to, rather than an entity from outside this country, a form of domestic terrorism.
Well, if an entity is operating within the country, and they're designated a terrorist entity under a designation list, then there are other mechanisms and tools that are given to law enforcement and to our CBSA. But I understand the ask that has been made. I just think it's hard for me to be here today and state an outcome that we don't know whether that outcome is there or not. But in terms of, that's really something that we'd have to wait to see whether the investigation leads us to make that conclusion, and whether law enforcement would categorize this as domestic terrorism. I don't think that it should be a political decision. It obviously needs to be a decision that's made under the parameters and requirements that are there already set in place for them to categorize it in this way.
Okay, which means you and I will speak about this again in future, but right now, Ms. Sahota, thank you very much. Appreciate the time.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Well, the funding announcement aside, without a doubt, the bigger political story today is that of Nunavut MP Lori Idlout. We heard some of the reaction to her floor crossing from her former NDP colleagues earlier, but now take a listen to what we are hearing from the 5 NDP hopefuls who are running right now to be the party's next leader. Edmonton MP Heather McPherson saying in part today, "I'm sad she's leaving and I'm disappointed she's joining the party we've been calling out together. There will always be voices that try to divide us, but as anyone who has spent time on a picket line knows, sticking together is how we make our voices heard. It's how we win." From leadership hopeful Tony McQuail, with the Liberals now within reach of a false majority, New Democrats must not dwell on the loss. We have to support our fellow members in University Rosedale, Scarborough Southwest and Terrebonne in whichever way we can to ensure that the Liberals do not use backroom deals to get a majority of seats when they lack a majority of votes. And from BC local politician Neil Johnston, quote, "Lori Idlout has always been a strong voice for Nunavut, and while it's disappointing to see her leave, I know this decision comes from a deep commitment to serving her community." Now, as for Union leader Rob Ashton and filmmaker Avi Lewis, the two expressed their support to the statement made earlier today by interim NDP leader Don Davies. And with that, let's now turn to Avi Lewis, because I did speak to Mr. Lewis late last week about his run for the leadership of the federal NDP. Here is a part of that conversation, which begins with questions about Mr. Lewis's 2 failed attempts to win a seat in Parliament. It's often said there's no safe NDP seat in the country. So you ran twice, you came in third in both those times.
Yeah.
What do you actually know about running a winning campaign?
Well, I think the last campaign in Vancouver Centre, to be honest, Michael, was the campaign of my dreams. We knocked on more than 50,000 doors. We had 800 volunteers. We saw Hedy Fry, our opponent's leaflets in 4 or 5 buildings. Vancouver Centre, as you know, is a unique riding with 1,000 buildings and fewer than 100 single-family homes. So we're the only riding without lawn signs. But we were in 600 of those buildings, and we didn't see any signs of the other campaigns. So I think we had an extraordinary campaign in terms of, volunteer energy and actually knocking on the doors and talking to thousands and thousands and thousands of voters. And I think it really wasn't the NDP's election for a lot of reasons. So I think we would have had a shot. If it had been a change election of the kind we had been anticipating, Hedy Fry had been there for 32 years at that point. People did want change. It just in the fear moment, they didn't, they went for Carney. Okay,
you have a shot, but is that enough when this party can ill afford another 2025? Quite frankly, whenever the next federal election happens, it becomes an existential vote for the NDP.
it is an existential vote for the NDP. And I think that's what makes me excited about participating in the race. I can't change the electoral record, and if having a seat already were a requirement for getting elected leader, then Jagmeet wouldn't have been elected leader because he didn't have a federal seat, and Jack wouldn't have been elected leader because he didn't have a federal seat. And so, we come to this as we come. And I think it's going to be up to the members to decide who has the vision that can really take us into the next chapter. And I appreciate Heather's record tremendously. Got a ton of respect for Heather McPherson. She's been a fantastic foreign affairs critic and a great MP. And if the ballot question for people is, do you already have a seat? She's got it locked up. I don't think that's how the NDP members are going to choose in this epic moment of a new direction for our party.
Okay, what would you have done differently then? In 2025, you described it as this black swan moment, and it's the shared analysis. Donald Trump changed the calculus of that election greatly. The entrance of Mark Carney changed the calculus of that greatly. But what would you have done? Had you been leader, how would you have reacted to those external events to change the outcome for your party?
I think that what was missing was a grand vision of how Canada stands up to Trump. And I think we've developed this on our campaign. And I have a pretty clear idea now of what I think it is. But at that moment, I don't think, when the writ dropped, I don't think most Canadians saw the NDP as viable in that existential moment for our country. And I think that's just what it was. But I think the election campaign, if there were any opening for us in the 2025 election campaign, it would have been to assert a really clear vision for how Canada could be run differently to protect us from Trump. And I think that Canadians then, as now, want an independent Canadian economy. And that means not doubling down on shipping off raw resources or trying to build 5% of our economy into military spending and be a major arms exporter. I think it actually means using the vast resources and the public and private wealth of this country to invest in confronting the cost of living crisis and directly fixing the major emergency in the lives of working class Canadians and Canadian majority.
Okay, you mentioned a lot. I'm going to get to hopefully all of them, but I'm going to begin with the cost of living challenge. Because you do, in the video that launched your campaign, you noted the fact that yes, Donald Trump is this big threat, but you identify as a bigger threat, and this is the quote, the bigger threat being the everyday emergency of trying to get by in an impossible economy. And to get through that, you propose things like a public developer to essentially address the housing crisis, a public option for telcos to address things like the high cost of internet, a public option for groceries. Why lean in on a public option on these multiple fronts?
Well, I think what we have in Canada, and this is what, and we've been able to tell a story during our campaign that only the NDP can tell, to help Canadians understand why life is so hard. People are working so hard, Michael. You know that people are taking on extra jobs, and it just never seems to be enough. And we're sobbing at the checkout of the grocery store because prices are so high. Meanwhile, we have 5 big grocery chains that control 80% or more of that market. We have 3 telecoms companies that control that market. We have 6 big banks that made $70 billion in profit in 1 year last year. So Canadians see all of this wealth stuck at the top with a handful of corporations dominating every sector. And this, I believe this is a case of market failure. We've left everything to the market. The government does not enforce competition. It allows effective monopolies. They collude, they price fix, and they have rigged the game against ordinary Canadians who cannot pay their bills.
But are you just punishing companies, the Canadian success stories? Because at the end of the day, these are corporate entities that employ thousands of people.
A Canadian success story doesn't gouge people, doesn't raise prices above inflation, doesn't relentlessly extract profits when people are suffering. There are reasonable levels of profit.
Is that the government's role to undermine private entrepreneurship?
It is the government's role to make sure that Canadians can lead a dignified life when they work their butts off. And right now, that is impossible for most people. And what we're actually calling for is the government to step up and actually intervene when the market is failing to provide the basics of life, food, shelter, healthcare, communication at a price that people can actually afford. And that means the public option has been used many times in our history. There have been many crowd corporations. In Saskatchewan, there is still a public phone company. And until recently, the private phone providers in Saskatchewan lowered their prices, in some cases 40%, and still made a profit, Michael. Responsible entrepreneurs still made a profit when there was a public option that actually kept the market competitive. And people pay much less for their cell phones. That's why if you have a friend from Saskatchewan, they still have a Sask number because they keep their SaskTel, because that's a precious thing. And we need that for housing, and we need that for food.
NDP leadership hopeful Avi Lewis. Now, you'll hear more from Mr. Lewis this weekend in a new episode of Profile, in which I interview all 5 candidates running to lead the federal party. And the full interview for Mr. Lewis, by the way, is right now posted on CPAC's YouTube channel. Well, that is our program for this evening. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. Primetime Politics is back tomorrow evening. Until then, take care.